There was a time a few generations ago when diabetes was quite rare. Most people lived out their lives and never got it, and they never knew anyone who had diabetes. Today, over half our American adult population is reported to be either diabetic or on their way to becoming diabetic. Why is this, and what can you do about it to make sure diabetes doesn't put its icy claws on you and your family? Dr. Jason Fung, perhaps one of the most knowledgeable experts on diabetes in the world, has called diabetes a dietary disease. And another term used by many is that diabetes is a lifestyle disease. Now, if this is true, and I'm convinced it is, this is both bad news and good news. The bad is we've been doing something terrible to ourselves and our generation by the way we eat and live. But on the positive side, this means that if how we've been living and eating has created diabetes or prediabetes in us, then it stands to reason if we change the way we've been living and eating, we should expect that diabetes and its terrible physical complications should begin to reverse themselves. I was in Walmart recently, and shortly before I was about to check out, I decided to get out of the line and go around and buy some of the junk foods that the store sold. I thought I could put some of these high-carb, high-starch, high-sugar junk foods on a table and create a picture which would vividly demonstrate all the terrible, nasty, unhealthy, pathetic foods we Americans are constantly stuffing in our mouths. And so I walked around the store putting things in my grocery cart I would normally never buy or even consider buying. As I filled my cart with donuts, pastries, muffins, chips, and so forth, I worried that if anyone should see me with these foods and recognize me from my Beat Diabetes channel, they would surely think me to be the biggest hypocrite in the world. I was already preparing my explanation as I put one junk food in my basket after another, but apparently I got away with it because no one said anything to me. At any rate, here's my collection of junk food and high-starch food, which is so deadly for diabetics and those on their way to becoming diabetics, which really involves almost everyone in America. But as I made my way around the store, it hit me harder than it ever had just how much unhealthy food this store offered. We're not talking about a few snacks. I had never quite realized that junk food and unhealthy food seemed to make up nearly half or more of the entire grocery store. Entire rows were filled with unhealthy, miserable, glucose-spiking foods. This chips and pretzels aisle is a perfect example. You're not given a couple of choices of chips or pretzels, you're given dozens of choices of chips of every imaginable kind. Corn chips, wheat chips, tortilla chips, potato chips, Pringles chips that come in a tube, chips with a sweet, spicy flavor, and on and on. These chips took up almost an entire aisle, and if you wanted, you could spend an hour just checking out the many available choices. Now, this store was no exception. Nearly every large grocery store in America would be similar. But the chips and pretzels aisle was just the tip of the iceberg. Just to the left of the entrance to the store was a monster section which contained all kinds of donuts and cakes and bread rolls and pastries and cookies. I'm not talking about 3 or 4 snacks being offered, people. I'm talking about dozens and scores of various snacks, bread products, and sweet foods, most of which have been made from 2 main ingredients, white flour and sugar. And it just so happens that the 2 most dangerous, the 2 deadliest, the 2 greatest enemies of diabetics are exactly these, white flour and sugar. There are others, of course, but these are the 2 biggest enemies a diabetic has. These are the big weapons our enemy uses to attack us, weaken us, and spike our blood sugar far beyond normal and healthy levels, which, of course, takes our insulin levels also far above healthy levels. Another category of unhealthy foods which take up an entire aisle is the breakfast cereal section. Brand after brand, box after box of cereals of every imaginable kind and color and taste appeal to gullible, unsuspecting shoppers, saying, "Buy me, I'm good for you. After all, the most important meal of the day is your breakfast." Some cereals boast of their added vitamins. Others attract children by their bright, sparkly colors. Some boast about their natural whole grains. After all, what could be healthier than a cereal that calls itself All Bran? Or a granola cereal which conjures up pictures of hiking in the mountains while singing "Sunshine on My Shoulder"? Diabetes on your shoulder and in your life would be more accurate. So what do all these cereals have in common? They're made with grains, usually wheat or sometimes corn, and both convert to sugar in your stomach lightning fast once you eat them. And in most cases, they're filled with added sugar. Once again, we have the deadly duo, grain products and sugar, the sworn enemies of the health of men and women around the world. But just to make you feel good about them, they'll throw in a few vitamins and then they'll have the nerve to call their product fortified. Fortified poison is more accurate. As I made my way throughout the store, I realized I couldn't possibly purchase snacks from all these different offerings, so I took out my phone and started snapping pictures. Row after row, product after product, and section after section of dangerous, unhealthy, so-called food items which are destroying the health of men and women throughout our nation. And it hit me harder than ever before. Our nation and much of our world are awash in unhealthy, health-destroying foods which tempt us on every side, every single time we walk through the aisles of our neighborhood grocery store. They beckon to us, they call out to us and tempt us. Try me, try me. I'll please your taste buds and make your life wonderful. Well, that may be true temporarily, but go to the hospital and talk to that man who's just been told he'll be on dialysis for the rest of his life. Or talk to that woman who just had her leg amputated above the knee, as happened with my own mother twice. Or talk to that young adult who just lost their mom or dad to diabetes while they were still in their 50s, when that mom or dad should have otherwise lived into their mid-80s. It turns out that these foods, which seem so glamorous to us on our grocery store shelves, are in fact terrible, life-taking, health-destroying monsters which are not our friends. We are drowning in an ocean of carbohydrates. There's a very good reason these stores stock these terrible foods on their shelves, and that is they know people will buy them, and of course their goal is to make money. If nobody ever bought breakfast cereal, guess what? The breakfast cereal aisle would soon cease to exist. They offer us junk because we buy junk, and we gladly pull out our debit cards and finance our own destruction. Another thought that occurred to me is that the average American buys these foods without a second thought. He or she never even considers it they're purchasing poison. They're spending their money for misery. As they check out, they don't feel guilty. They don't feel the slightest bit conflicted. They purchase their glucose-spiking foods and snacks blissfully ignorant of the misery that they will bring. They buy these miserable foods for themselves, and they buy them for their entire families. Not only do they invest in diabetes for their own latter years, they make an investment in the eventual diabetes of their children as well. The main reason people can buy and eat these kinds of foods without guilt or even a second thought is that they're deceived by the fact that you can indeed eat them and get by with it for a meal, for a month, a year, or even 10 or 20 years. It's not as though you eat some sugary white flour-based cereal and head straight for the diabetic ward the next day. It may take you half of your adult life before you take your first trip to the emergency ward. But there's a strong possibility that sooner or later you will pay the price, far more than the few dollars you paid for that cereal or those donuts or chips or cakes at the store. There is a biblical phrase, sheep for the slaughter. And when you see men and women, otherwise intelligent and reasonable, filling their carts with all kinds of junk food, that phrase applies very well. In America and in much of our world, by stuffing our mouths and our bellies with white flour and sugar and carbs and carbs and more carbs, we are making ourselves sheep for the slaughter. Diabetes is following close behind us, riding a dark horse, and he's carrying a sickle in his hand by which he is reaping a terrible harvest of misery, sickness, and death in our world. Now, some of you may be saying, well, you focused on the unhealthy foods, but we have to eat something. What can we eat? Well, I'm glad you asked that question. Here's one section you don't have to be afraid of: nuts and seeds. Most nuts and seeds are relatively low carb and very much low glycemic. They simply do not spike blood sugar much at all. Nuts and seeds are like logs, while carbs and sugars are like kindling to glucose levels. Nuts and seeds are fairly high calorie, however, but that could be a good thing if you're slim and you're wanting to go low carb, but you're afraid you'll lose too much weight. Much of the produce section is safe for diabetics. There are many low-carb vegetables that are nutritious and do not spike glucose. And, of course, they're natural, which is no small benefit. I stay away from corn and potatoes, but most other vegetables I will eat. I would avoid beets because they're pretty sweet, but I never liked beets anyway, so they're not much of a temptation to me. For most diabetics, it's far safer and wiser to stay in the produce section than to go into those middle aisles where all the food is processed and put in bags and boxes. Meats of all kinds are not going to significantly spike glucose. Just make sure they don't have a bread coating on them. Fish is a good choice, but don't be afraid of red meat. The old advice about the evils of red meat turns out to have been nothing more than fake news. And chicken is also not a problem for glucose levels, and you can cook it in 1,000 different ways. Cheese is a great option. I love cheese, and I especially use it to fill me up when my main dish doesn't quite do the job. Cheese is very filling, and normally it's quite low in carbs. Another dairy product I enjoy is heavy whipping cream. I put it in my coffee, and I use it in making mug cakes of different kinds. I couldn't begin to guess how much heavy cream I've drunk since my blood sugar problems began, but I can tell you it would probably fill up a good-sized swimming pool. An alternative for cream is unsweetened almond milk. I do use it sometimes, but my preference is the heavy cream. And who doesn't love eggs? They have a scrawny 0.5 gram of carbs each. They're delicious, and you can eat them in 1,000,000 different ways. And of course, in every mug cake, a single egg is at the heart of the recipe. And while you're shopping, be sure and pick up some almond flour and coconut flour. I use these all the time, and if you're looking for a recipe that serves as an alternative for some type of bread product, you're likely to find a recipe that calls for almond flour or coconut flour or both. Now, these are just some examples of foods that have served me well since those early days when it was becoming apparent that I was following in my mom's footsteps to the land of diabetes. That was one destination I had no desire to go. And by the grace of God, I never did arrive at that terrible place. So, to get back to the questions, how did America become a nation of diabetics and pre-diabetics? And then the other question, what can we do about it? The answer to the first is we ate ourselves to that land of diabetes. Sure, genetics plays a role, but you could take most diabetics living today and put them in a time machine and send them back to 1840, and they almost certainly would stop being diabetic by living and eating as people did in those old days. You know, the days when there were no breakfast cereals, no Little Debbie snack cakes, no sodas, no pretzels, no chips, no candy bars, and fruit was only available for a few weeks during the year. Of course, we can't go back in time, but what we can do is eat more like great-great-great-grandpa did and be a little more active and a little less of a couch potato, and we may just discover that diabetes has mysteriously and wonderfully packed its bags and disappeared. I want you to know that I do have another YouTube channel. It's called by my name, Dennis Pollock, And on this channel, I teach the Bible. I do short little 6- and 7-minute devotionals normally on all kinds of Bible topics. If you're having a rough week and need some encouragement, or you just want to know what does the Bible actually say, you need to check out my Dennis Pollock Bible channel. There'll be a link in the description below.